Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Sage Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm talking about my top 10 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. As of the last couple weeks, many of you have reached out via the comment section and asked Andrew, are you going to continue your ranking series? A couple weeks ago, we talked about my top 12 running back rankings. So today, I wanted to talk about the wide receiver position. The primary reason why I've condensed it down to 10 wide receivers is because the players that are typically in my rankings around 11, 12, 13 have all already been talked about. Over the course of the last week, I've talked about my must-draft wide receivers, which consisted of Michael Pittman Jr., Michael Williams, A.J. Brown, and in my opinion, those are the wide receivers I would slot in that 11, 12, 13 range. Now, I know when we're talking about the top 10 wide receivers, oftentimes we're splitting hairs, but I, of course, will be going through statistics that justify the reasonings as to why I've ranked my top 10 wide receivers as such in a half PPR scoring format in order to give you some perspective and help you make the right decisions in your upcoming drafts. Now, for those of you who are trying to get an expanded look at my rankings and trying to get more experience for your upcoming drafts, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, not only will you get a deposit match up to $100 when you use promo code Andrew today, you'll also receive an email from me with my 2022 fantasy football draft rankings, which consist of half and full PPR scoring formats. These rankings are by tier at the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, kicker, and defensive positions, and also includes my top 200 flex rankings. So, not only are you going to get my rankings, sign up for Underdog, and get some experience via their best ball draft, you'll also get updated rankings every single week, typically on Saturdays, in order to make sure that throughout the entire month of August, regardless of how many drafts you have, you are up to date on my rankings in order to help you make the right decisions for your 2022 fantasy football leagues. So for those of you who are interested, be sure to go down to the description of the video, click on that link, and use promo code Andrew today via Underdog Fantasy. Thank you very much. Also, if you have not yet already, we're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season on a daily basis. So for those of you who are trying to gain an edge on your league mates and win a 2022 fantasy football championship, be sure to subscribe today. Thank you very much. All right, let's talk about my top 10 wide receiver rankings going into the 2022 fantasy football season, beginning with our reigning, defending number one overall wide receiver from 2021, Cooper Kupp, Super Bowl champion, Super Bowl MVP, the Triple Crown winner. Again, for those of you who aren't familiar with what the Triple Crown is, Cooper Kupp led the National Football League last year in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. There have only ever been two other wide receivers in the history of the National Football League who have accomplished that. That is Jerry Rice and Sterling Sharp. Incredible company, to say the least. Now, I'm pretty sure I don't need to drown you guys out with statistics regarding Cooper Kupp. We know the level of player he is. He demonstrated that over the course of 20 games last season. So, besides the fact that I'm going to be mentioning a couple records that he broke last season, it's pretty apparent. I believe he's going to be able to have another successful season. We may see some declines. We may see a little bit of regression in some specific statistics, whether it's overall targets, receptions, but ultimately I do expect him to return as the number one overall wide receiver in fantasy football and should be drafted as such. Now, let's talk about some of those records that he broke last season. A couple of ones that he was just shy of breaking. Obviously, Calvin Johnson's NFL record for receiving yards. Cooper Kupp had 1,947, while Calvin Johnson had 1,964. Pretty close, but obviously the extra game. He almost broke Michael Thomas's record for most receptions in a season. He was 4 away from that. But in terms of the records he actually broke, longest streak of games with 90 plus receiving yards. He had 11 games last season of 100 plus receiving yards, which broke Michael Irvin's prior record. He had 9 games of 100 plus receiving yards and a touchdown. 15 games of 7 plus receptions. Again, that's another record. He also had the most receptions of 25 or more yards in a season. The only other wide receiver that's ever been close to him is Tyreek Hill in 2018. Other than that, the next highest is dating back to 1991. We're talking about elite level production. But not only that, if in fact we were to eliminate all of Cooper Kupp's touchdowns last year, if we eliminated all 16, Cooper Kupp would have still finished as the number 4 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. Just putting into perspective just how valuable he was in terms of receptions and receiving yards last year. And the reason Cooper Kupp was able to accomplish all of this was because he maintained a 30.56% target percentage. That is targets by routes run. He had 192 targets in 625 routes that he ran. Targeted 30+% of the time. I mean, those are just incredible numbers. I haven't seen a wide receiver eclipse that mark in quite some time. But again, like we know, the Los Angeles Rams are defending champions. Matthew Stafford's coming off the best statistical season he has had since 2011, throwing 41 touchdowns last year. He's only going to get more and more comfortable within this offense and with Cooper Kupp as their rapport continues to build. I'm excited about the potential. Cooper Kupp's my number one. Moving on. Let's talk about Justin Jefferson, my number 2 wide receiver going into the 2022 season. Obviously, throughout the course of his career, he's found incredible success. In fact, he broke the record for the most receiving yards by a wide receiver within their first 2 seasons ever. 3,016 yards is how much he's accumulated. Over the course of his career with Kirk Cousins under center, anytime Justin Jefferson has played 75% or more of the offensive snaps, which means he didn't leave with an injury or wasn't limited early in his rookie year because they weren't 100% certain whether he could be on the field the entire time. In those 27 games, Justin Jefferson has averaged 17.53 fantasy points per game. He is obviously an elite talent. He went from his rookie year of being the number 6 overall fantasy wide receiver, then improving the following year by a total of 46.2 half PPR fantasy points, to becoming the number 4 overall wide receiver. His upward trajectory leads him into this path of potentially being a top 2 wide receiver, but I'm even of the opinion that he could very easily dethrone Cooper Kupp and become the number 1 wide receiver this year. If there's anybody capable of doing so, Justin Jefferson is. Now, going into 2022, there's going to be a coaching change within the Vikings offense. We bring in Kevin O'Connell, the former, of course, offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams. He is going to be implementing a very Sean McVay-esque offensive approach where you're using a lot of 11 personnel, 3 wide receiver sets, moving around these wide receivers, and using Justin Jefferson as the Cooper Kupp of this Minnesota Vikings offense. Now, this offseason, Kevin O'Connell, in the multitude of interviews that he participated in, has been very adamant on the idea that Justin Jefferson is going to be the Cooper Kupp. And Justin Jefferson even confirmed this a couple days ago where he was quoted as saying, "I understand why Cooper Kupp was getting open so often last season, because they're using him in that position. They're using him in those route combinations." Again, what the Los Angeles Rams did better than anyone last season was allowing Cooper Kupp to have coverage matchups against linebackers. Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods led the National Football League in terms of wide receivers and the percentages of their routes that they ran against the linebacker position, which gives them opportunities that a lot of wide receivers aren't going to see. That's obviously a matchup nightmare for any linebacker in the National Football League, regardless of how fast you are. But the fact that the Rams and now the Minnesota Vikings will be keying in on those ideas, Justin Jefferson's overall upside continues to rise in 2022. Like I've mentioned in videos past in regards to this offense, when Kevin O'Connell was brought in, there was a lot of conversation regarding Kirk Cousins because they have a past relationship. Back in Washington, Kevin O'Connell was his quarterback's coach. Again, Kirk Cousins, back-to-back seasons of over 4,200 passing yards and 33 passing touchdowns. Though Cousins' statistics have been great, as long as he continues to play as well as he has, continues to funnel target Justin Jefferson in 2022, the sky's the limit. Again, Justin Jefferson, according to Pro Football Focus, last season was the number 2 wide receiver against man coverage and number 7 against zone coverage. He's an extremely talented young lad, and I really do believe he's going to be able to take that next step and become a top 2 fantasy wide receiver this year. Moving on to Jamar Chase, former teammate of Justin Jefferson in college. We talk about Jamar Chase coming off of the greatest rookie season a wide receiver has ever had in fantasy football. I mean, the amount of statistics, 264.1 fantasy points. Was it double-digit touchdowns? I mean, a very shallow amount of overall targets. What did he have, 128? When you are given more opportunity, based on the talent that Jamar Chase has already demonstrated, his potential is only going to rise in 2022. Again, in comparison to the other wide receivers who previously held this record of the most fantasy points by a rookie in fantasy football history, we have Odell Beckham Jr. from 2014, and we have Justin Jefferson from 2020. Justin Jefferson, like I mentioned prior, his rookie year, 230 points. He went ahead and elevated that by a total of 46.2 fantasy points in his following season. Odell Beckham put up 249.5 fantasy points his rookie year, elevated that to 271.3. So if we're expecting Jamar Chase to elevate his game, to get more targets in this offense, for this offense to be that much more successful because of the experience they've gained, then hey, the number 3 spot is perfect for Ja'Marr Chase. Now, I know a lot of people will bring up the conversation as to the 3 games that Ja'Marr Chase had last season, which accounted for almost 40% of his total fantasy point contribution. There is going to be a special place in my heart for a very long time in regards to that Week 17 performance that Ja'Marr Chase had, where he put up 50.1 fantasy points. Obviously, many of us were either at the opposing end of it and got completely bombed on, and some of us benefited from Ja'Marr Chase putting up those numbers. Now, for those of you who believe that Ja'Marr Chase is going to see regression in 2022, understand that even if we remove that 50.1 fantasy point contribution that he had in Week 17, he would have still averaged 14.03 fantasy points per game last year. A lot of the production that he had obviously came from the deep ball passing game and the receiving touchdowns that he had last season. Again, he led the National Football League in terms of receptions of 20 or more yards down the field, which led to 8 of his touchdowns. When you compare that to other elite wide receivers over the past decade, that's in the same conversation as Tyreek Hill in 2020, who also had 8 receiving touchdowns, 20 or more yards down the field. Antonio Brown was able to accomplish this twice in the last decade, in 2018, where he had 9 receiving touchdowns in that manner, and in 2016, he had himself 8 touchdowns in that manner. When we take into account that Ja'Marr Chase's ADOT, his average depth of target, was 13.6 yards down the field last season, that was tied for 4th, only behind Tyler Lockett, Devonta Smith, and Terry McLaurin. We're talking about deep ball wide receivers. Of course, Ja'Marr Chase has to be in that conversation. But as we go into the 2022 season, I've heard an interview where, of course, Ja'Marr Chase mentioned he is looking to capture and earn the Triple Crown in 2022. That is his goal for this year. He wants to lead the wide receiver position in receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. If he can accomplish that, then he certainly deserves to be in this top 3 conversation. But not only that, the Bengals as an entire offense are going to improve. They signed 3 offensive linemen this offseason, which is only going to help protect Burrow and give him more time in the pocket to find and open Ja'Marr Chase in 2022. Moving on, let's talk about Stefon Diggs, wide receiver of the Buffalo Bills. Stefon Diggs, even prior to the fact that he was traded to the Buffalo Bills, was a great fantasy wide receiver. In Minnesota, he was the number 11 overall wide receiver in 2018. In 2019 was the number 21 overall wide receiver, but over the course of the last 2 years, he has elevated his game to another level, finishing as the number 3 and number 7 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. Again, he's been averaging 15.12 fantasy points per game in the last 2 seasons with the Buffalo Bills. Now, going into 2022, there's been a lot of conversation as to whether or not the absence of Brian Daboll, their former offensive coordinator, now the New York Giants head coach, is going to impact what they are going to accomplish this upcoming season. Ken Dorsey, who is currently their offensive coordinator, has been there for the last couple years. He has been the passing game coordinator and quarterbacks coach in seasons past. So I'm 100% of the opinion that we're going to see a very clean transition from one offensive coordinator to another. Again, this is a team that targeted their wide receiver position the second most time since 2020, since Stefon Diggs has gotten to this offense. There's a reason why he has seen 166 and 165 targets in each of the last 2 seasons. So if we're going to talk about a wide receiver that sees optimal levels of opportunity in one of the highest scoring offenses with a quarterback that has had himself over 4,400 passing yards and 36 passing touchdowns in each of the last 2 seasons, the de facto number 1 of that offense is obviously going to find success. You go ahead, you remove Cole Beasley and Emmanuel Sanders in terms of taking away targets from Stefon Diggs this season. I mean, that's 184 vacated targets of potential that can be added upon the 165 that he's averaged over the last 2 years. You get to that 180 range, maybe Stefon Diggs gets himself into that top 3 wide receiver conversation. Stefon Diggs last season led all wide receivers for the Buffalo Bills in terms of third down targets, in terms of targets when Josh Allen was either being blitzed, under pressure, or in the red zone. Any one of those varieties, he is leading the team in those categories. And it all makes sense. He's an elite level talent. He's scored 18 touchdowns in the last 32 full games that he has played. And despite the fact that he's played against top tier cornerbacks in the last 2 years, Stephon Gilmore, J.C. Jackson, Byron Jones, Xavier Howard, in his own division, he's averaged 16.87 fantasy points per game in the 12 games he's played against the AFC East. He's a dominant player and deserves to continue to be treated as such. He's my number 4. Moving on. We have CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb sitting at this position was difficult for me to an extent. He hasn't really developed into the top tier player that we wanted to see. Specifically last year, we expected him to be easily a top 12 wide receiver. Unfortunately, wasn't capable of doing that. But over the course of the last 2 seasons with Dak Prescott under center, we have seen CeeDee Lamb average 12.51 fantasy points per game. That's 21 total games in which they've played together. Last season, we saw him deal with a couple injuries. We saw Amari Cooper deal with a couple injuries. But this offense as a whole was still one of the top in the National Football League. They led all teams in terms of total offensive yardage and points per game. So if we're in the conversation of the Dallas Cowboys transitioning from being one of the top offenses and maybe still being in that conversation in 2022, the fact that you go ahead and remove Amari Cooper and Cedric Wilson from this equation, don't have Michael Gallup for majority of the early half of this season, there is a boatload of potential opportunity for CeeDee Lamb to take that next step and become a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. Again, that's 164 vacated targets just between Amari Cooper and Cedric Wilson last season. When we go back to 2019, when Amari Cooper was the lone wide receiver of this offense and there wasn't a CeeDee Lamb, Amari Cooper accomplished a great season in which he was the number 9 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. That gives me confidence that not only can CeeDee Lamb be in that conversation of a top 10 wide receiver, but I think he could very easily take the next step forward because now this offseason, we have seen James Washington go down with an injury. They haven't addressed the wide receiver position. And if the running game isn't as effective or as efficient as we thought it was going to be because of the departures we saw in their offensive line, whether it was Connor Williams or Lyle Collins, then passing the ball is going to be their primary source of offense. Again, anytime Dak Prescott has targeted CeeDee Lamb in his career 6 or more times, CeeDee Lamb is averaging 15.46 fantasy points per game. That should be a bare minimum between these two going into the 2022 season. As the de facto number 1 of a top-tier offense, I think the sky's the limit. They've targeted their wide receivers the 4th most times over the course of the last 3 years. Not only do I believe that CeeDee Lamb has the skill to accomplish this feat of becoming a top 5 wide receiver, I think he should be able to do this year and for many years to come. Moving on, let's talk about Davante Adams. Speaking of someone who has been a top 5 wide receiver in their career, Adams has accomplished that a couple times. You know, in 3 out of the last 4 seasons, he's been a top 3 overall wide receiver. He knows a thing or two about success. Again, in 2021 was the number 3. In 2020 was the number 1. And again, in 2018 was the number 3 overall wide receiver. The only reason he wasn't able to accomplish a top 3 standing in 2019 was because he missed time with a turf toe. Nonetheless, over the course of the last 2 years, he has been one of the best wide receivers in the National Football League, with Aaron Rodgers going on back-to-back, MVP tours. Of course, Davante Adams has exploded in terms of his overall fantasy point production. In the last 27 games with Aaron Rodgers, averaged 20.85 fantasy points per game. Those are incredible statistics. In 5 out of the last 6 seasons, he has scored 10-plus touchdowns. Again, the only season he wasn't able to do so was 2019 because he missed time due to an injury. But hey, we know how great Davante Adams is. I don't need to tell you, you're aware of that. But how good is he going to be now that he goes from the Green Bay Packers offense with an MVP, future Hall of Famer quarterback, Aaron Rodgers, to now going to Las Vegas, playing with his former college quarterback, Derek Carr. That is correct. This is going to be the second time that a Packers legend wide receiver goes from Green Bay to Las Vegas. Formerly was Jordy Nelson in 2018, but now we have the opportunity to see Davante Adams meet up with his former college quarterback who they played together in 2012 and 2013, and they found a lot of success. For those of you who haven't seen the statistics that they put up in college, in 2012, of course, Davante Adams had 102 receptions, 1,312 receiving yards, and 14 receiving touchdowns. The following year, they went off 131 receptions, 1,719 receiving yards, and 24 receiving touchdowns. They continue to elevate their game, and their rapport that they built in college unfortunately had to branch and break away in the NFL, as one was drafted to Green Bay and the other to the Oakland Raiders at the time. But now you're bringing them back together. And the last time that Derek Carr has really had a solid group of wide receivers, you could argue, was the last couple years, 2020, 2021, with a combination of Darren Waller and Hunter Renfrow, but both of them weren't able to succeed at the same time. Waller in 2020 had himself 145 targets, 107 receptions, and if you counted him as a wide receiver in a half PPR, would have been the number 8 wide receiver. This last season, Hunter Renfrow in 2021 was the number 11 overall wide receiver with 103 receptions, 128 targets, incredible numbers. But if you go back to 2015 and in 2016, Derek Carr was capable of helping 2 wide receivers become top 15 players. Again, Michael Crabtree and Amari Cooper in 2016 were the number 11 and number 13 ranked wide receiver in fantasy football. Both of those guys found a lot of success in this offense. But now that you insert Davante Adams into this offense with a new head coach, I really do think that 2 wide receivers, maybe even all 3 of these receiving options, Waller, Renfrow, and Adams, can all find success. But first and foremost, Adams is going to have to get his. He's going to have to see 150, 160 targets in order to justify the trade that they made and the amount of money that they're paying him this season. The last thing that I wanted to mention regarding Davante Adams, the last time Josh McDaniels was the offensive coordinator of a team where he had a wide receiver similar to Davante Adams was back in 2007 and 2008 when the New England Patriots got a wide receiver by the name of Randy Moss. In 2007, Randy Moss had 160 targets, 98 catches, almost 1,500 receiving yards, and 23 touchdowns. Again, that was the year that Brady went for 50 passing touchdowns. They went undefeated during the regular season. It was a great year. But even the following year, when Brady went down with an injury and Matt Castle was the starting quarterback, Randy Moss still had himself over 1,000 yards, 11 receiving touchdowns, 70 catches. There is a lot of potential success to be had here with Davante Adams in Las Vegas. I'm excited about this potential. Moving on to Mike Evans. Mike Evans has been one of the most consistent wide receivers in fantasy football by a relatively wide margin. In the last 8 consecutive seasons, he has had 1,000 receiving yards minimum. Again, that's since 2014. Like, no other wide receiver has been able to get to Mike Evans' level, regardless of who has been under center for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, obviously, over the last 2 years, Mike Evans has definitely benefited from the fact that the GOAT has played for the Tampa Bay Bucs. Again, Mike Evans has averaged 14.37 fantasy points per game in the last 2 years with Tom Brady under center. In back-to-back seasons, he's had 70-plus receptions, 1,000 receiving yards plus, and 13 or more receiving touchdowns. We're talking about elite-level production. 27 touchdowns in the last healthy 30 games that Mike Evans has participated in with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But we're all aware of how great he has been. Let's talk about Tom Brady. Again, Tom Brady last season set a career high in passing attempts, passing completions, and passing yardage. He set his second highest passing completion percentage and achieved his second highest passing touchdown total of his entire career. The third highest fantasy point per game total Brady has ever had. If it wasn't for the fact that Tom Brady came back and unretired, Mike Evans wouldn't be in this conversation. I mean, yes, last season when Brady targeted Mike Evans, he had a 128.5 passer rating. Those are great numbers, but without Tom Brady, this doesn't happen. These numbers are not as accessible. And to continue that train of thought, you got to remember, in the last 2 seasons, Brady has thrown the ball deep down the field more than he ever has, and they've found so much success in the red zone based on how much talent they've had. I mean, looking at the last 2 seasons in the red zone, Mike Evans inside the 10-yard line has scored 8 and 9 touchdowns. That's 17 in the last 2 seasons. Now, going into 2022, there is no longer Ronald Jones. There's no longer Rob Gronkowski, Antonio Brown. You bring in Russell Gage, Kyle Rudolph. You bring in a couple rookie running backs. You also have the opportunity of playing with Julio Jones. I think that all of that is certainly going to play a factor in the overall upside of Mike Evans, but I think he's still the number 1 priority of this offense outside of running the ball with Leonard Fournette. Therefore, Mike Evans claims my number 7 overall ranking at the wide receiver position. Moving on to number 8, we have Deebo Samuel, who just recently signed a big contract with the San Francisco 49ers, pretty much keeping him there for the immediate future. Now, the main miss that majority of us had in fantasy football last season was that we all invested in Brandon Ayuk instead of Deebo Samuel. And the reason why that even occurred, just so that we're all on the same page, is because Deebo Samuel, in the first 2 years of his career, 2019 and 2020, he missed 10 games. That injury history is obviously well documented, and there's always a potential of him getting injured in the future. But we have to remember that in 2020, Brandon Ayuk had a 7-game stretch where he was averaging 15.15 fantasy points per game with the San Francisco 49ers offense. And I understand Brandon Ayuk eventually went to becoming a player that Kyle Shanahan hated during the summer, put him in the doghouse, and really didn't let him really start playing in that offense until late in the season. But that was the main reason why a lot of us were off on Deebo Samuel and onto the hype train of Brandon Ayuk. Now, going into 2022, maybe we're all getting it twisted. Maybe we've all bought into the Deebo Samuel hype a little bit much. We're going to get a quarterback change, and from all the clips that I've seen of Brandon Ayuk this offseason, he may look like he's the steal of this offense. But nonetheless, if you decide to invest in Deebo Samuel, let me explain to you some of the things that he was able to accomplish last season and could very easily duplicate in 2022. Last season, Deebo Samuel had 1,770 total yards from scrimmage, which ranked third amongst all players in the National Football League. He set the record at the wide receiver position for most rushing touchdowns in a season with 8. That record previously stood for 60 years, broke that record. He was number 1 in yards per reception with 18.2 as his average amongst all wide receivers with 40 or more targets. He also led all wide receivers in terms of yak per reception, yards after the catch per reception, which was a 10.4 yard average. He was number 2 amongst all receiving options in terms of yak with 779, only behind Cooper Kupp. Now, of course, we know Deebo Samuel also contributed via the rushing game last season. 59 attempts for 365 rushing yards, 8 rushing touchdowns, a 4.71 yard per carry after contact average, which was more than any other running back that had 100 or more rushing attempts last season. He had 13 rushes of 10 or more yards. Deebo Samuel is obviously a special player. In the 3 games last season where he only had 1 reception, he still averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game. Again, he is a very special talent. It doesn't even have to be done through the air. It can be done on the ground. And the incentives that are included in his new contract kind of speak to the idea that they're going to use him in the running game, but I don't know if it'll be at the high capacity as it was last year, where it was 5 to 8 rushing attempts per game. If we get into that, conversation, we're back to seeing Deebo putting up 18 points a week, because we know he is a talented enough player that you put the ball in his hands, he's going to make defenders miss and find the end zone, to say the very least. Now, if in fact we went ahead and eliminated all of Deebo Samuel's rushing statistics from his overall box score in 2021, he would have still finished as the number 9 overall ranked wide receiver with 215 total fantasy points. From weeks 1 through 9 of the 2021 season, in an 8-game span, he was averaging 10.1 targets per game, 110 receiving yards per game, and 17.61 fantasy points per game. Again, the reason why they eventually got him into the backfield and running the ball as much was because Elijah Mitchell dealt with an injury. Then, of course, we saw Jeff Wilson Jr. deal with an injury. JaMychal Hasty went down, and they didn't want to use Trey Sermon. So in order to avoid that, use more Deebo Samuel. Nonetheless, what we all want to hear is how well can Deebo Samuel potentially perform with Trey Lance in 2022? Well, I am a believer of Trey Lance. In the 2.5 games that he played last season with Deebo Samuel had 10 catches for 228 yards, 3 receiving touchdowns, which was all totaled for 45.8 fantasy points. If you go ahead and take it by a per game basis, that's 9.2 targets per game and 18.32 fantasy points per game. There's a lot of potential for Deebo Samuel. I'm excited about what Trey Lance has to offer and how he's going to help Deebo Samuel maintain his wide receiver 1 standing. Moving on, we have Tyreek Hill as our next wide receiver. This is another wide receiver out of the bunch that we've mentioned that is going to be leaving his old team and joining a new one. He was traded to the Miami Dolphins this offseason, but we have to remember just how great he has been in seasons past. In 4 out of the last 5 seasons, Tyreek Hill has been a top 6 fantasy wide receiver. The only time he didn't accomplish that was in 2019 when he dealt with that early injury. Week 1 against Jacksonville, injured, missed a pretty good chunk of time. He came back on that Monday Night Football game against the Los Angeles Chargers, left again with an injury. That year was riddled, yet they still won the Super Bowl. Nonetheless, we're talking about one of the most talented wide receivers in the National Football League, and I'm sure we can all agree upon the fastest wide receiver in the league. Now, because of that speed, he has found himself to be a very valuable fantasy prospect for our teams, though he has been volatile. When we have gone and looked at the statistics he's put up since 2018, Tyreek Hill has had 19 games of 20 or more fantasy points, while he's had 17 games of less than 10 fantasy points. Now, in the middle there is a couple games here and there where he'll be decent. He'll put up 10 to 15 fantasy points, and we'll take those. But he's been relatively volatile. He's a pop-off player where he's either winning you the week or often sometimes shows up, doesn't score a touchdown, gets himself 5 catches for 40 yards, and wasn't a big part of the game plan because, again, there was Travis Kelce. There were other receiving options in that offense that had to take priority at times. With that said, now we move him to an offense that is going to be play called by Mike McDaniel. Again, Mike McDaniel is the former offensive coordinator of the San Francisco 49ers, and we just talked about Deebo Samuel. I think Tyreek Hill could very easily fit into that Deebo Samuel role, and I'll tell you exactly why. This offseason, Mike McDaniel was asked, what players are you excited about? And he specifically said this about Jalen Waddle, but I think this could very easily be kind of transition to the idea of Tyreek Hill, because at the time of this quote, Tyreek wasn't on the team. He said, the best and easiest way to get yards is to give it to the really talented players. The 49ers in the last 4 to 5 years have led the league in yak because we're addicted to getting our skill position players the ball. Again, Tyreek Hill last season, the number 11 ranked wide receiver in terms of yak with 447. Not only that, since 2016, in terms of his rushing upside, he's had 93 attempts for 719 yards. That's 7.73 yards per carry average and 6 rushing touchdowns. So not only is he a yak monster because of his speed, not only is he an offense that is going to accentuate that, but he's also going to get rushing attempts in this offense that will only increase his overall potential. But now I'm going to hear it, Andrew, but Tua, he's not good enough. He's not accurate enough. He doesn't have the arm strength. Guys, you go back to 2017 with Alex Smith. Tyreek Hill was the number 4 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. He has done it with other quarterbacks in the past. You go back to 2019, Matt Moore stepped in when Patrick Mahomes dislocated his knee in that Thursday Night Football game against the Denver Broncos. I was watching that game at a local Islands restaurant. I remember it. In that 3-game span with Matt Moore, Tyreek Hill had himself 49.5 fantasy points. Again, if you're going to be averaging upwards of 15 fantasy points with backup quarterbacks, backup, I say that in quotations, and we've heard Tyreek Hill quoted to say, Tua is 10 Matt Moores. I think there's a lot of potential for this offense to take that next step and be a lot better than people think. That's why Tyreek Hill right now really is kind of at a discount. Let's not forget last season in 2021, Tua was the most accurate quarterback in terms of deep passing, in terms of adjusted passing completion percentage. Adjusted passing completion percentage does not take into account throwaway passes, batted down balls, and drops by their own wide receivers, which would all be basically not Tua's fault. So overall, he's got the ability to do it. He has shown this offseason, whether it's at training camp, whatever, that he can throw the ball deep. Anything that you've seen that says otherwise, again, that's the Dolphins media team feeding you information in order to get you riled up on Twitter to start tweeting away and giving them more impressions. Nonetheless, Tyreek Hill's a stud. Let's move on to the final wide receiver. Number 10 on my list. We talked about him already this offseason, but T. Higgins, in my opinion, should be a top 10 wide receiver in fantasy football when it's all said and done at the end of 2022, because he has proven that with Joe Burrow and Ja'Marr Chase on the field, he can be exactly that. Over the course of the last 21 games with Joe Burrow under center, T. Higgins has averaged 13.44 fantasy points per game. Last year, if he had not gone down with an injury and played all 17 games for this team, he would have been the number 9 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, putting up over 220 fantasy points. In the last 10 games that we saw T. Higgins participate in last year, in 7 of those games, he was able to surpass 95 or more receiving yards, which also includes the playoffs, which is even better cornerbacks and even greater competition, which gives you more confidence that T. Higgins has taken that next step and gotten to the elite wide receiver conversation. Joe Burrow last season was able to put up 4,600 passing yards and 34 passing touchdowns. When we talk about the potential of him being able to support 2 top 12 wide receivers, over the course of the last 7 seasons, we have seen in 2020, Minnesota and Seattle, 2018, Pittsburgh and Minnesota, and 2016, New Orleans and Green Bay all produce 2 top 12 wide receivers in those given years. What all of those quarterbacks had in common was they were all at a minimum putting up 4,200 passing yards and 30 passing touchdowns. Again, those are the numbers that we mentioned regarding Kirk Cousins earlier in this video, and I 100% believe Joe Burrow can surpass those numbers at a pretty good rate. You improve his offensive line, you give him more time, you no longer make him the most sacked quarterback in the league, you protect your franchise quarterback. I think Joe Burrow could very easily throw for 5,000 yards and 40 touchdowns and get T. Higgins and Ja'Marr Chase easily in that top 10 conversation together. We were able to see it. From weeks 8 through 17, once T. Higgins returned from his injury, T. Higgins was the number 7 overall ranked wide receiver in terms of total fantasy points at that time, while Ja'Marr Chase was the number 8 overall ranked wide receiver. Again, we've seen them both produce in the same offense at the same time. I think the stats speak for themselves. those are my top 10 wide receiver rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Again, if you are looking for my more expansive rankings in terms of my top 100 wide receivers, top 36 quarterbacks, tight ends, top 100 running backs, top 200 flex, all of that, even my top 16 kickers and defenses by tier. If you're interested in that, be sure to check out Underdog Fantasy today. Use promo code Andrew when you make a first-time deposit. Again, the minimum deposit is $10. If you sign up there with $10, you'll go ahead, not only get the deposit match via Underdog Fantasy, not only get the opportunity to draft via the multitude of best ball tournaments, but you'll also get sent an email from me that will be updated weekly with my half and full PPR draft rankings this month. Again, it's a great offer. You can either go that way or go down in the description and check out my Patreon. It's $10 a month. Same value, just depends what benefits you are looking for. The Underdog Fantasy ones or the Patreon ones. Check it out. Take advantage of it. And until next time, which will be tomorrow, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you guys. Peace.